The bridge of the Nebula Kingdom scout ship buzzed with activity as the crew examined the peculiar signals emanating from the distant planet. Captain Vrixia stood at the helm, her 4 eyes narrowed in concentration as she studied the data streaming across the display panels. "Fascinating," she murmured, her mandibles clicking thoughtfully. "These emissions are unlike anything we've encountered before. The waveforms, the modulation. It appears to be a form of communication, but unlike any language in our databases." Vrixia turned to her second-in-command, Sub-Lieutenant Calm. "What's your assessment? Could this be the signature of an undiscovered sentient species?" Calm's tentacles twitched as he reviewed the sensor readings. "The evidence certainly points in that direction, Captain. The complexity of these transmissions suggests a level of technological sophistication, even if the planet itself appears to be in a relatively primitive state of development." He paused, his eyes scanning the tactical display. "However, I must caution that the source of these signals also appears to be erratic, unpredictable, even. There are fluctuations and anomalies that do not fit any known communication pattern." Vrixia nodded slowly, her antennae twitching. "Noted. Whatever is happening on that world, it seems to be a deviation from the norm. We'll need to approach this situation with the utmost care and caution." She turned to the communications officer. "Prepare a message for relay back to the Nebula Kingdom. Inform High Command of our findings and request further instructions." As the crew set to work, Vrixia returned her gaze to the main view screen, where the distant planet hung in the blackness of space, its surface obscured by swirling clouds. Something about this world intrigued her, like a puzzle waiting to be solved. She couldn't help but wonder what other secrets it might hold. Several cycles later, the scout ship received a response from Nebula Kingdom High Command. Vrixia's mandibles clicked with a mixture of anticipation and trepidation as she read the orders. "They want us to establish direct contact with the planet," she announced to her crew. "A diplomatic envoy is being prepared as we speak, and they expect us to facilitate the first encounter." Colin's tentacles coiled in a gesture of unease. "Direct contact with an unknown species, one that appears to be broadcasting such unsettling signals." He shook his head. "Forgive me, Captain, but that seems like an exceedingly risky proposition. We know nothing about these humans or their intentions." Vrixia raised a calming hand. "I share your concerns, Sub-Lieutenant, but orders are orders, and High Command believes the potential benefits of establishing relations with this new civilization outweigh the risks." She paused, her eyes narrowing. "Besides, I can't help but be intrigued. There's something about these humans that piques my curiosity. If they truly are a sentient species, then they could hold the key to unlocking new frontiers of knowledge and understanding." Colin's expression remained doubtful, but he nodded in acquiescence. "Very well, Captain. I will prepare the ship for the journey and coordinate with the envoy team." As the sub-lieutenant moved to carry out his tasks, Vrixia turned her attention back to the view screen, studying the distant planet with a sense of growing anticipation. What would they find on this world? What strange and wondrous discoveries might await them? The prospect of being the first to make contact with an entirely new intelligent species filled her with a mix of trepidation and exhilaration. The journey to the human homeworld was uneventful, but the air on the bridge grew increasingly tense as they drew closer to their destination. Vrixia could sense the anxiety and uncertainty amongst her crew. This was uncharted territory, both literally and figuratively. As they entered the outer reaches of the human system, the scout ship's sensors began detecting more of the strange energy transmissions. Vrixia studied the data, her mandibles clicking in deep thought. "The signals are growing stronger," she murmured, "and they seem to be emanating from multiple points across the planet's surface. This is no simple broadcast. It's a complex, interconnected network of communications." Calm stepped up beside her, his tentacles twitching. "Truly remarkable. If these humans have developed a global communications infrastructure of this scale, then they may be far more advanced than we initially presumed." He paused, his expression darkening. However, the erratic nature of the transmissions is still concerning. There are spikes in energy output, sudden shifts in modulation. It's as if the signals are being generated by an unstable, volatile system. Vrixia nodded slowly. Agreed. We must proceed with the utmost caution. Once we're within range, hail the planet and request permission to establish diplomatic contact. Make it clear that we come in peace and that our intentions are purely exploratory. The sub-lieutenant moved to relay the orders, but before he could, a new alert flashed on the tactical display. Vrixia's eyes widened as she studied the readings. Calm. We have incoming vessels. Human craft of some kind. They appear to be armed and are on an intercept course. She turned to the helm. Evasive maneuvers, but do not fire upon them. Maintain a peaceful posture. As the scout ship began to evade the approaching human vessels, Vrixia felt a twinge of unease. This was not the warm welcome she had hoped for. Something about these humans seemed unpredictable, even unstable. And if their initial response was one of aggression, then perhaps the warnings in their broadcasts were not mere idle threats. Vrixia braced herself for the inevitable first contact, knowing that the fate of this encounter could have far-reaching consequences, not just for the Nebula Kingdom, but for the entire known galaxy. The scout ship maneuvered deftly, evading the human vessels as they closed in. Vrixia watched the tactical display with growing trepidation, her mandibles clicking incessantly. Hail them again, she ordered the communications officer. Stress our peaceful intentions and request a parley. We must make contact before this situation escalates further. After a tense moment, a response crackled over the speakers. Vrixia leaned forward, her antennae perking up, as a human face appeared on the view screen. A female with peculiar features, her skin a pale, almost pinkish hue. This is Captain Sarah Johnson of the United States Space Command. The human spoke in a tone that was both authoritative and laced with suspicion. You are trespassing in our space. Identify yourselves and state your purpose, or we will be forced to open fire. Vrixia took a steadying breath before responding. I am Captain Vrixia of the Nebula Kingdom scout ship Aethera. We come in peace, seeking to establish diplomatic contact with your people. We mean you no harm. Sarah Johnson's brow furrowed. And for a moment, Vrixia thought she detected a flicker of surprise in the human's expression. Diplomatic contact. The captain scoffed. You're a long way from home, alien. What makes you think we're interested in your kind of diplomacy? Vrixia held up a conciliatory hand. Please, Captain Johnson, let us discuss this further. We have much to learn from one another, and I believe there is much we can offer in the way of mutual understanding and cooperation. The human's eyes narrowed. Cooperation. You think we're just going to welcome you with open arms? After the way your kind have terrorized our neighbors. She shook her head, a humorless laugh escaping her lips. I don't think so. You've got a lot of nerve showing up here uninvited. Vrixia felt a twinge of confusion. Terrorized your neighbors? I'm afraid I don't understand. We have had no prior contact with your species, nor do we have any history of aggression towards other civilizations. She paused, her antennae twitching. Perhaps we've gotten off on the wrong foot. If you would allow us to land and meet with your leaders, I believe we could clear up any misunderstandings. Sarah Johnson's expression darkened. No way in hell. You think I'm just going to let a bunch of alien invaders waltz onto our planet? We don't take kindly to strangers around here, especially not ones that come barging in with their fancy ships and technology. She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing to slits. You've got one chance. Turn around and leave, or we'll blow you and your little scout ship out of the sky. Vrixia's mandibles clicked rapidly as she processed the human's hostile response. This was not at all what she had expected. Where was the curiosity, the eagerness to engage with a new species? Instead, she was met with suspicion, aggression, and an unmistakable threat. Colin stepped up beside her, his tentacles coiling in a gesture of unease. Captain, I strongly advise against provoking these humans further. Their weapons may be primitive, but they appear to be highly volatile and unpredictable. We should withdraw and report back to High Command." Vrixia hesitated, her eyes flickering between the view screen and the tactical display. The human vessels were still closing in, their weapon systems primed and ready. She knew Kaln was right. Continuing to push for contact would be foolish and potentially disastrous. But a part of her still burned with curiosity, with a desire to understand these strange, aggressive creatures. "Very well," she finally said, her mandibles set in a determined line. "Helm, set a course for a safe distance, and prepare to jump to FTL. But maintain a passive sensor sweep. I want to learn as much as we can about these humans before we depart." As the scout ship began to pull away, Vrixia watched the human vessels closely, her mind racing. What had triggered such a violent reaction? Were the humans truly as primitive and uncivilized as their behavior suggested, or was there something more complex at play? One thing was certain: the Nebula Kingdom could not afford to ignore this discovery. These humans, for all their apparent hostility, represented a potential threat that could not be ignored. Vrixia knew she would need to report her findings to High Command, and they would undoubtedly want to address this situation with the utmost caution and strategic foresight. As the scout ship disappeared into the depths of space, Vrixia couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that this was only the beginning of a much larger, more complex story. The humans had piqued her curiosity, and she was determined to unravel the mystery of their nature and their intentions, even if it meant risking the fragile peace of the known galaxy. Back on the human homeworld, Sarah Johnson watched the alien vessel disappear from view, her jaw set in a tight, determined line. She turned to her subordinates, her eyes narrowed. "Scramble all available forces," she ordered. "I want every ship we have ready to mobilize at a moment's notice. If those alien bastards try to come back, we'll be waiting for them." One of the officers, a young lieutenant, hesitated. "Ma'am, are you sure that's wise? We don't know the full extent of their capabilities. Provoking them could be." "I don't care about your doubts, Lieutenant," Sarah snapped, cutting him off. "Those aliens are a threat, plain and simple. They may claim to come in peace, but we all know how that story ends." She clenched her fist, her knuckles whitening. "No, we can't take any chances. Not after what happened to the Proxima colony." The lieutenant nodded reluctantly, his expression troubled. "Understood, Captain. I'll relay the orders immediately." As the bridge crew scrambled to action, Sarah turned her gaze back to the empty expanse of space, her mind racing. She had no intention of letting these alien invaders set foot on Earth, not after the devastation they had already wrought. They would learn the hard way that humanity was not to be trifled with. The Nebula Kingdom Diplomatic Corps moved swiftly in the wake of the scout ship's failed first contact attempt. High Command was deeply concerned by Captain Vrixia's report, and they wasted no time in assembling a specialized envoy team to return to the human homeworld and try again to establish cordial relations. Leading the envoy was Counselor Thalas, a seasoned diplomat with a reputation for patience and a keen understanding of diverse alien cultures. Flanking him were two of the Nebula Kingdom's finest xenoanthropologists, tasked with analyzing the humans and developing effective communication strategies. As the envoy ship approached the outer edges of the human system, Counselor Thalas convened a final briefing with his team. "Based on Captain Vrixia's report, we are dealing with a species that is both technologically advanced and yet culturally primitive," he began, his mandibles clicking thoughtfully. "They appear to have a global communication network and the capability for spaceflight, yet their leaders also display a troubling propensity for aggression and mistrust." Thalas turned to the xenoanthropologists. "Zilara, Nerok, what insights have you gleaned from your analysis of the human broadcasts? How might we best approach these Earthlings, as they call themselves?" The female xenoanthropologist, Zilara, stepped forward. "Our study of the human transmissions has revealed a complex, fractured society. There appear to be numerous competing factions, each with their own agendas and varying degrees of technological sophistication. Additionally, the content of their broadcasts is often contradictory and emotionally charged, suggesting a high level of political instability and ideological conflict. Narok, the male xenoanthropologist, chimed in. Based on this, we believe the key to successful negotiations will be to identify and engage with the more moderate, rational elements within human society, appealing to their sense of curiosity and wonder at the prospect of joining the galactic community may prove an effective strategy. Phallus nodded thoughtfully. Excellent analysis. And what of their apparent hostility towards our previous overtures? How might we address that? Zilara's tentacles coiled in a gesture of uncertainty. That is the most concerning aspect of our findings. The humans seem to harbor a deep-seated mistrust and even animosity towards other intelligent species. Their leader, this Captain Johnson, made direct threats of violence against our scout ship. We must tread carefully, lest we inadvertently provoke a violent reaction. Narok stepped forward. However, I believe there may be an avenue to overcome this obstacle. The human broadcasts also indicate a strong sense of cultural and territorial pride. Perhaps by acknowledging their sovereignty and framing our presence as a diplomatic gesture of goodwill, we can appeal to their sense of autonomy and allay their fears of alien invasion. Phallus considered this for a moment, then nodded. A sound strategy. We will proceed cautiously, with an emphasis on respect and mutual understanding. He turned to the rest of the envoy team. Remember, our mission is to establish peaceful contact and lay the groundwork for future cooperation. Avoid any actions or statements that could be perceived as threats or demands. We are guests in their domain, and we must conduct ourselves accordingly. With the briefing concluded, the envoy ship continued its approach to the human homeworld. As they neared the edge of the system, Phallus felt a twinge of unease. The memories of Captain Vrixia's tense first encounter still lingered, and he couldn't shake the sense that these humans were unlike any species the Nebula Kingdom had dealt with before. Nevertheless, he was determined to succeed where the scout ship had failed. The potential benefits of establishing diplomatic ties with this new civilization were simply too great to ignore. With patience and careful diplomacy, he was confident they could overcome the humans' initial hostility and forge a path towards mutual understanding and cooperation. The envoy ship emerged from FTL just beyond the outermost edge of the human system, their sensors immediately detecting the presence of numerous human spacecraft. Phallus steeled himself, then hailed the nearest vessel. "This is Counselor Phallus of the Nebula Kingdom Diplomatic Envoy. We come in peace and wish to open negotiations with your leaders. Please respond." After a tense moment, the comm crackled to life, and the familiar face of Captain Sarah Johnson appeared on the view screen. Well, if it isn't our alien friends," she drawled, her expression a mixture of suspicion and disdain. "I thought we made it clear last time. You're not welcome here. Turn around and go back where you came from, or we'll be forced to take action." Phallus raised a conciliatory hand. "Captain Johnson, please, let us discuss this rationally. We mean you and your people no harm. We simply wish to establish diplomatic relations and explore the possibility of mutually beneficial cooperation." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "Cooperation? Ha! You think we're just going to roll out the welcome mat for a bunch of extraterrestrial invaders?" She scoffed, shaking her head. "Not a chance in hell. We've had our fair share of dealing with your kind, and it never ends well." Phallus felt a twinge of confusion. "I'm afraid I don't understand, Captain. The Nebula Kingdom has had no prior contact with your species. We are newcomers to your world, seeking to learn and engage, not to conquer or exploit." "Save it," Sarah spat. "We know your kind, all right. The way you've been terrorizing our neighbors in the Proxima system. Don't think we haven't been watching." She leaned forward, her expression darkening. "Well, we're not about to let you do the same to us. Earth is ours, and we'll defend it at all costs." Phallus blinked, his mandibles clicking rapidly as he processed this new information. Proxima system. Neighboring species. What was she talking about? It was clear there had been some kind of misunderstanding, but he could already sense the conversation spiraling out of control. Desperate to regain the initiative, Phallus tried a different approach. Captain Johnson, I understand your concern, but I assure you, we mean no harm. Perhaps we could arrange a face-to-face meeting where we can discuss these matters in a more constructive manner. Sarah let out a harsh, humorless laugh. A face-to-face meeting. Yeah, right. You must think I was born yesterday. She shook her head, her expression darkening. No, I'm done playing nice. You've got one last chance. Turn around and leave, or we'll open fire. The choice is yours. Phallus felt a growing sense of dread as the human vessels began to power up their weapon systems. Clearly, their attempts at diplomacy had failed. Somehow, they had stumbled into a conflict that they knew nothing about, and the humans were determined to meet them with uncompromising hostility. As the envoy ship hastily retreated, Phallus knew they would need to report back to High Command immediately. This situation was rapidly spiraling out of control, and the Nebula Kingdom would need to act quickly and decisively if they hoped to avert a full-scale confrontation with this unpredictable and volatile new species. The envoy ship made a hasty retreat, its crew shaken by the encounter with the hostile human forces. Counselor Phallus sat in his quarters, mandibles clicking as he replayed the conversation with Captain Sarah Johnson in his mind. The level of aggression and distrust the humans had displayed was deeply unsettling. Phallus had encountered his fair share of challenging negotiations over the course of his diplomatic career, but nothing quite like this. There was a volatility and irrationality to the humans that he found profoundly unsettling. As the ship sped back towards Nebula Kingdom space, Phallus summoned his team of xenoanthropologists for an emergency debriefing. Something is deeply amiss here, he began, his eyes narrowed in concentration. These humans seem to harbor a profound animosity towards us, despite the fact that we have had no prior contact with their species. The references to alien invaders and terrorizing our neighbors make no sense within the context of our initial encounter. Zilara, the lead xenoanthropologist, nodded gravely. I agree, Counselor. Our analysis of the human broadcasts has revealed a pervasive sense of paranoia and hostility towards other intelligent life forms. They appear to have some past experience with an aggressive alien species that has shaped their worldview. Narok, the other xenoanthropologist, spoke up. However, our data indicates that the humans themselves have not yet achieved the level of interstellar travel or technological sophistication necessary to have encountered any other spacefaring civilizations. Their hostility seems to stem more from rumor and speculation rather than direct experience. Phallus hummed thoughtfully. That is deeply troubling. If these humans are operating on the basis of unfounded fears and misconceptions, it will make negotiating with them all the more challenging. He paused, mandibles clicking. Do we have any insight into the nature of this alien threat they believe we represent? Zilara tapped a few commands into her datapad, bringing up a series of human broadcast transcripts. Based on our analysis, it seems the humans have encountered an aggressive, expansionist species they refer to as the Proxima invaders. According to their reports, these invaders have been systematically conquering and subjugating nearby star systems, including the Proxima colony that lies within their sphere of influence. Narok leaned forward, his tentacles coiling. The humans appear to believe that we are somehow affiliated with or connected to these Proxima invaders. They seem convinced that our arrival is the prelude to a similar campaign of conquest and subjugation against their own world. Phallus felt a growing sense of frustration and concern, but that is completely unfounded. The Nebula Kingdom has had no dealings with any such Proxima invaders, nor do we have any history of aggressive expansionism. We are a peaceful, exploratory civilization, driven by curiosity and a desire to engage with new species, not to conquer them. Zilara nodded solemnly. I understand your frustration, Counselor. But the reality is, these humans appear to be operating on a fundamentally different set of assumptions and experiences than we are. Their worldview is dominated by fear, suspicion, and a deep-seated distrust of outsiders. Attempting to reason with them may prove exceedingly difficult. Thalos let out a heavy sigh, his antennae drooping. Then we are at an impasse. If the humans refuse to even entertain the possibility of diplomatic engagement, how can we hope to establish the mutual understanding and cooperation that is so vital to the Nebula Kingdom's interests? Narration spoke up, his voice tentative. Perhaps, Counselor, we have been approaching this the wrong way. Instead of trying to force negotiations, we should consider taking a step back and reevaluating our strategy. Perhaps there is a way to indirectly address the humans' fears and misconceptions and slowly build a foundation of trust. Thalos mulled this over, his mandibles clicking thoughtfully. An intriguing proposition. Narration. Elaborate, if you will. The xenanthropologist straightened, his tentacles twitching with an idea. Rather than pressing for direct contact and negotiations, what if we were to instead focus on gathering more information about these Proxima invaders the humans are so afraid of? If we could uncover the true nature of this threat and demonstrate that we have no affiliation with it, perhaps that would help allay their concerns. Zilara's eyes widened as she caught on to Narax's train of thought. Yes, that could work. By proving our neutrality and innocence in this matter, we may be able to slowly chip away at the humans' distrust and open the door for more productive dialogue in the future. Thalos nodded slowly, a glimmer of hope kindling in his chest. A wise suggestion, both of you. Very well. That shall be our new course of action. We will return to Nebula Kingdom space and relay our findings to High Command. They must be made aware of this Proxima invader situation and its potential implications for our future dealings with the humans. As the envoy ship continued its journey, Thalos couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The humans' hostility and irrationality were deeply troubling, and he knew that navigating this situation would require the utmost patience and strategic thinking. But for the sake of the Nebula Kingdom's future, he was determined to find a way to bridge the gap and establish productive relations with this new, seemingly volatile species. One thing was certain. The story of humanity's first contact with the greater galactic community was only just beginning, and Thalos had a feeling it would be a tumultuous journey filled with unexpected twists and turns. The envoy ship's hasty retreat from the human system did little to ease the growing concerns of Nebula Kingdom High Command. Counselor Thalos' report only deepened the sense of unease and urgency within the leadership. This is a most troubling development, HFY, the Nebula Kingdom's supreme diplomatic authority, said grimly. These humans seem to harbor a deep-seated animosity towards our kind, and their apparent technological capabilities, while primitive, are still disconcerting. Thalos nodded, his mandibles clicking. Indeed, Archon. Even more concerning is their belief that we are somehow affiliated with this Proxima invader threat they claim is terrorizing their neighboring systems. They seem utterly convinced that our arrival heralds the onset of a similar campaign of conquest and subjugation against their own world. HFY's antennae twitched in a gesture of contemplation. And you say your attempts to reason with them and establish peaceful dialogue were met with nothing but hostility and threats of violence. I'm afraid so, Thalos replied, his tone grave. Captain Johnson and her human forces made it abundantly clear that they have no interest in diplomatic overtures. They appear to operate under the assumption that all alien civilizations pose an existential threat to their species. The Archon's eyes narrowed. This is most troubling. If these humans are as volatile and irrational as your report suggests, then they pose a grave risk not just to themselves, but to the delicate balance of power within the known galaxy. Thalos inclined his head. Precisely my concern, Archon. The Nebula Kingdom cannot afford to ignore this situation, for the humans' erratic behavior and hostility towards outsiders could have far-reaching consequences. HFY drummed her claws against the arm of her chair, her expression pensive. Then we must take decisive action. We cannot allow this new species to potentially disrupt the fragile peace we have worked so hard to maintain. She turned to the assembly of senior diplomatic and military officials. What are our options? One of the admirals, a grizzled veteran named Crixus, stepped forward. Our intelligence suggests the human forces are still relatively primitive in their military capabilities, relying on chemical-based propulsion and projectile weapons. While they may pose a threat to our scout ships, a larger Nebula Kingdom fleet would be more than a match for them. Thalos raised a hand, his antennae twitching. I would caution against any overt displays of force. Admiral, the humans are already operating under the assumption that we mean to conquer their world. Anything that could be perceived as an act of aggression may only serve to heighten their hostility and paranoia. Crixus snorted, his mandibles clicking in disdain. Diplomacy has already failed, Counselor. If these humans refuse to listen to reason, then we must be prepared to take more decisive action. HFY raised a calming hand. I understand your concerns, Admiral, but Counselor Thalos raises a valid point. We must tread carefully lest we inadvertently provoke a full-scale confrontation. She turned to the assembly, her gaze sweeping across the room. Perhaps a middle ground can be found, a strategy that demonstrates our power and resolve, but without triggering an outright conflict. After a moment of thoughtful silence, one of the senior xenoanthropologists spoke up. What if we were to establish a blockade around the human system? She suggested. A show of force that restricts their ability to project power beyond their own borders, but without directly engaging their forces. HFY's eyes widened, and she nodded slowly. Yes, that has merit. A blockade would allow us to contain the human threat, while also giving us the opportunity to gather more intelligence and potentially open new avenues for dialogue. Thalos considered this proposal, his mandibles clicking. It is a calculated risk, to be sure. But if executed properly, it may be our best option for addressing this situation without resorting to outright hostilities. HFY turned to the Admiral. Crixus, begin preparations for a Nebula Kingdom fleet deployment to the human system. Establish a tight blockade, but make it clear that our intent is not conquest, but rather the preservation of peace and stability within the galaxy. Crixus nodded, his expression grim. It will be done, Arction. We'll show these humans the true might of the Nebula Kingdom, and remind them that aggression against our people will not be tolerated. As the meeting adjourned, Thalos couldn't help but feel a twinge of unease. While the blockade strategy seemed prudent, he knew all too well the volatility of the human species. There was no guarantee that they would respond with the same measured restraint, and the potential for the situation to spiral out of control was ever present. Still, Thalos knew that the Nebula Kingdom had little choice but to act. The humans' erratic behavior and unfounded hostility represented a threat that could not be ignored. If left unchecked, their actions could have disastrous consequences for the fragile peace that had reigned over the known galaxy for centuries. As the Nebula Kingdom fleet made its final preparations for deployment, Thalos found himself hoping that this gambit would succeed in calming the humans' fears and opening the door for more meaningful dialogue. The fate of his people, and perhaps even the entire galactic community, now rested on the outcome of this perilous endeavor. The Nebula Kingdom fleet dropped out of FTL, just beyond the outer edge of the human system, their massive warships casting an imposing shadow over the planet Earth. HFY's voice boomed across the open communication channels, her tone firm but measured. People of Earth, this is HFY of the Nebula Kingdom. We come not as conquerors, but as emissaries of peace. It has come to our attention that you harbor grave misconceptions about our intentions and the nature of our civilization. She paused, her antennae twitching. We wish only to establish cordial relations and open a dialogue that may lead to mutually beneficial cooperation. However, your hostile actions against our previous envoy have left us with no choice but to take decisive action to ensure the stability and security of the known galaxy. Vreya's mandibles clicked authoritatively. Therefore, we are instituting a blockade around your home system. No ships will be permitted to enter or leave until such a time as we can resolve the misunderstandings between our peoples. This is not an act of aggression, but rather a necessary measure to prevent the escalation of tensions." She fixed the camera with a solemn gaze. "We implore you, people of Earth, to heed our words and consider the possibility of cooperation rather than confrontation. The fate of your world, and indeed the future of the galaxy, hangs in the balance." With that, Vreya terminated the transmission, and the Nebula Kingdom fleet spread out, establishing a tight cordon around the human system. Counselor Thalas, who had accompanied the fleet, watched the proceedings with a mixture of trepidation and cautious optimism. "I pray this strategy proves effective," he murmured to Admiral Crixus, who stood beside him on the bridge. "The last thing we need is a violent escalation of this conflict." Crixus's mandibles clicked dismissively. "The humans will see reason, Counselor. Faced with the might of the Nebula Kingdom, they will have no choice but to acquiesce to our demands." Thalas shot the Admiral a dubious look. "I would not be so quick to underestimate them, Crixus. Their behavior thus far has been anything but predictable. We would do well to approach this situation with caution and vigilance." The Admiral snorted. "Caution is for the weak-willed, Thalas. Sometimes the best path forward is to demonstrate unequivocal strength." He turned his gaze back to the view screen, his expression hardening. "Mark my words, these humans will learn to respect the power of the Nebula Kingdom." Back on Earth, the news of the Nebula Kingdom's blockade sent shockwaves through the global community. Captain Sarah Johnson sat in her office, her brow furrowed as she reviewed the latest intelligence reports. "Damn aliens," she muttered, her fingers drumming angrily on the armrest of her chair. "I knew they couldn't be trusted. Now they've got us boxed in, trying to bully us into submission." The young lieutenant from the previous encounter stood before her, his expression tense. "Ma'am, the fleet is ready to engage, but I must advise caution. These Nebula Kingdom ships are far more advanced than anything we've encountered before. Going up against them directly could be—" "I don't care about your doubts, Lieutenant," Sarah snapped, cutting him off. "We can't just sit back and let these aliens dictate terms to us. Earth is ours, and we'll defend it at all costs." Her eyes narrowed. "Prep the fleet for combat. If those alien bastards won't leave us alone, then we'll make them." The lieutenant hesitated, his brow furrowed. "Captain, I understand your concerns, but an outright attack could be disastrous. Shouldn't we at least try to negotiate?" Sarah let out a harsh, humorless laugh. "Negotiate? With those monsters?" She shook her head, her expression hardening. "No, Lieutenant. We're done playing by their rules. It's time to show them the true strength of humanity." Sensing there was no arguing with the captain's decision, the lieutenant reluctantly saluted and hurried off to carry out her orders. Sarah leaned back in her chair, her jaw set in a determined line. "You're not the first aliens to try and push us around," she muttered, her gaze fixed on the holographic display of the Nebula Kingdom blockade. "And you won't be the last. But this time, you've picked a fight with the wrong species." The Nebula Kingdom fleet maintained its vigilant watch over the human system, their sensors scanning for any signs of activity or attempts to breach the blockade. Counselor Thalas paced the bridge, his antennae twitching with unease. "Something is not right, Crixus," he murmured, his mandibles clicking. "The humans have been curiously quiet since we established the blockade. I would have expected them to mount some kind of response by now." The Admiral scoffed, his eyes fixed on the tactical display. "They're likely cowering in fear, Thalas. The sight of our might has cowed them into submission." Thalas shot the Admiral a dubious look. "I would not be so quick to make that assumption. These humans have proven themselves to be unpredictable, to say the least." He paused, his expression darkening. "I fear we may be underestimating them once again." Suddenly, the sensors blared to life, and the crew sprang into action. Crixus' eyes widened as he studied the readings. "By the stars, they're launching an attack." He growled, his mandibles clicking in a mixture of disbelief and frustration. Their ships may be primitive, but they're coming at us with impressive speed and coordination. Thales felt a chill run down his spine as he watched the human vessels surge forward, their weapons blazing. Evasive maneuvers, raised defensive shields. We cannot afford to underestimate them again. As the Nebula Kingdom fleet scrambled to defend itself against the unexpected human onslaught, Thales knew that their carefully laid plans had just been upended. These humans were proving far more resilient and adaptable than anyone had anticipated, and the counselor feared that the consequences of this miscalculation could be dire. The fate of the Nebula Kingdom's mission, and perhaps even the stability of the entire galaxy, now hung in the balance. The Nebula Kingdom fleet scrambled to respond to the unexpected human attack, its defensive shields absorbing the barrage of primitive projectile weapons. Counselor Thales gripped the edge of the command console, his mandibles clicking with a mixture of frustration and amazement. "I warned you, Crixus," he said, his voice tight. "These humans are far more resilient and adaptable than we gave them credit for." The Admiral's mandibles flared in a snarl. Resilient or not, they will soon learn the true might of the Nebula Kingdom. He turned to the tactical officer. "Target their primary weapon systems and neutralize them. We cannot allow these upstart humans to threaten our vessels." As the Nebula Kingdom's advanced energy weapons lashed out, Thales watched anxiously. The human ships, while seemingly primitive in design, were maneuvering with surprising agility, evading the barrage with unexpected ease. "Their reaction times are remarkable," he murmured, his antennae twitching. "And their coordination is far beyond what we would expect from a species at their apparent stage of technological development." Crixus let out a frustrated growl. "Enough of your analysis, Thales. We are wasting time. Intensify the bombardment. Show these humans the true power we wield." The Nebula Kingdom fleet unleashed a devastating salvo, pummeling the human vessels with a relentless barrage of energy blasts. Thales could see the human ships beginning to take damage, their shields faltering under the onslaught. But to his growing alarm, the humans did not retreat or surrender. Instead, they responded with a new tactic, splitting their forces and launching a series of coordinated attacks from multiple vectors. "They're adapting," Thales breathed, his eyes widening. "Crixus, we must adjust our strategy, or we risk being overwhelmed." The Admiral's mandibles clicked in defiance. "Overwhelmed? Impossible. Our ships are vastly superior in both firepower and maneuverability. These humans are nothing more than primitives, flailing about in a futile attempt to challenge our might." Thales opened his mouth to argue, but before he could speak, the bridge was rocked by a series of powerful explosions. Several of the Nebula Kingdom vessels had sustained critical damage, their shields failing under the relentless human assault. Crixus' expression shifted from one of confidence to one of alarm. "What is the meaning of this? How could they?" "I told you, Crixus," Thales interrupted, his tone grave. "We have gravely underestimated these humans. Their adaptability and resourcefulness are beyond anything we could have predicted." The Admiral's mandibles clicked furiously. "Then it is time we unleash the full might of the Nebula Kingdom. Dispatch the heavy cruisers and order them to employ their most devastating weaponry. These humans will learn the true consequences of defying us." Thales hesitated, his antennae twitching with unease. "Crixus, I must protest. Escalating the conflict in such a manner could have catastrophic consequences, not just for the humans, but for the entire galactic community." "I will hear no more of your concerns, Thales," the Admiral snapped. "The time for diplomacy has passed. Now we must demonstrate the true power of the Nebula Kingdom and crush these insolent humans once and for all." As the heavy cruisers moved into position, Thales felt a growing sense of dread. He knew that Crixus' decision to unleash the Nebula Kingdom's most powerful weapons was a grave mistake, one that could have far-reaching and disastrous consequences. But the Admiral was unyielding, his thirst for victory overriding any sense of caution or restraint. Thales could only watch helplessly as the Nebula Kingdom fleet unleashed a devastating barrage upon the human forces, their energy beams and missile salvos tearing through the primitive human ships with ease. The human vessels fought back with desperate tenacity, their pilots maneuvering with incredible skill in a valiant effort to avoid the Nebula Kingdom's onslaught. But in the end, their antiquated technology and limited resources proved no match for the overwhelming firepower of the Nebula Kingdom's heavy cruisers. One by one, the human ships fell, their hulls breached, and their crews succumbing to the vacuum of space. Thales felt a deep, sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach as he observed the carnage, his mandibles clicking in a mixture of sorrow and regret. "This was not the way," he murmured, his eyes fixed on the view screen. "We have made a grave mistake in underestimating these humans, and now we may have doomed them to utter annihilation." Crixus, however, seemed oblivious to the counselor's distress, his expression one of triumphant glee. "At last, the humans have learned the price of their defiance. Now, let us secure our control over their system and ensure that no more of their kind dare to challenge the might of the Nebula Kingdom." As the last of the human vessels were destroyed, Thales turned away, his antennae drooping. He knew that this victory, if it could even be called that, would come at a terrible cost. The humans had proven themselves to be a force to be reckoned with, and the Nebula Kingdom's heavy-handed response had only served to deepen the divide between the two species. Thales feared that the seeds of a much larger conflict had been sown this day, one that could have devastating consequences for the entire galaxy, and he knew that he and his people would be forever haunted by the weight of this tragic misjudgment. As the last embers of the human resistance were extinguished, a heavy silence descended upon the Nebula Kingdom fleet. Counselor Thales stood on the bridge, his mandibles clicking with a mixture of sorrow and disquiet. The once proud human vessels lay in ruins, their charred hulls drifting listlessly amidst the debris. Thales felt a deep pang of regret as he surveyed the devastation, his antennae drooping. "What have we done?" he murmured, his voice tinged with anguish. Admiral Crixus, however, seemed oblivious to the counselor's distress. His mandibles clicked in a triumphant display as he addressed the fleet. "A decisive victory for the Nebula Kingdom," he proclaimed, his eyes gleaming with pride. "These humans have learned the true cost of defying our authority. Let this be a lesson to any who would dare challenge our might." Thales shot the admiral a withering glare. "A victory, Crixus. I hardly believe that is an accurate assessment of what has transpired here today." He gestured toward the remains of the human ships. "We have not conquered a foe, but rather annihilated a species that, despite its primitiveness, has shown a remarkable capacity for resilience and adaptability." Crixus's mandibles clicked in disdain. Resilience. Adaptability. Bah! These humans were nothing more than barbarians, flailing about in a futile attempt to resist the inevitable. He puffed out his chest, his eyes narrowing. "We have done the galaxy a service by putting them in their place." Thales shook his head, his antennae twitching with frustration. "You failed to see the bigger picture, Crixus. These humans, for all their flaws, have demonstrated a level of tenacity and resourcefulness that should give us pause." He turned his gaze back to the remains of the human fleet. "We have underestimated them at every turn, and now we may have sown the seeds of a much larger conflict, one that could have devastating consequences for the entire galactic community." The admiral scoffed, his mandibles clicking dismissively. "Consequences, Thales. What consequences could these primitive beings possibly pose to the might of the Nebula Kingdom?" He gestured grandly. "We have crushed their resistance. They are broken, defeated. There is nothing more to fear from them." Thales fixed Crixus with a stern gaze. "That is where you are mistaken, my friend. The humans may be technologically inferior, but they have shown a capacity for innovation and adaptation that could prove formidable if provoked." He paused, his mandibles clicking thoughtfully. "And if we have indeed crushed their spirit, then we may have robbed the galaxy of a species that could have offered unique perspectives and insights, had we approached them with more understanding and less aggression." Crixus's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Phallus thought he saw a flicker of doubt in the Admiral's expression, but it was quickly replaced by a renewed sense of self-assurance. "Your concerns are noted, Phallus," Crixus said, his tone laced with condescension. "But the decision has been made, and the humans have been dealt with. Now, it is time for us to secure our control over their system and ensure that no further threats emerge." Phallus opened his mouth to protest, but before he could speak, a series of urgent alerts began blaring from the tactical console. "Admiral, we've detected a massive energy surge emanating from the human homeworld," the officer reported, her tentacles coiling in alarm. "It appears to be some kind of automated defense system, powering up in response to our actions." Crixus's mandibles clicked in a mixture of surprise and irritation. "Impossible. We have decimated their fleet. What more could these humans possibly have to throw at us?" Phallus felt a chill run down his spine as he watched the tactical display. The energy readings were off the charts, and the sheer scale of the human defense network was astounding. He had been right to doubt the Admiral's confidence. These humans were far from broken or defeated. "Evasive maneuvers," Crixus barked. "Raise all shields to maximum power. We cannot allow these primitives to catch us off guard again." As the Nebula Kingdom fleet scrambled to defend itself, Phallus felt a bittersweet realization dawn on him. For all their technological and cultural shortcomings, the humans had proven themselves to be a force to be reckoned with, a testament to the indomitable spirit and resourcefulness of their species. And in that moment, Phallus found himself grudgingly admiring their tenacity. These were not the actions of a broken, defeated people, but rather the defiant last stand of a civilization unwilling to surrender its autonomy and sovereignty. "Remarkable," Phallus murmured, his mandibles clicking in a gesture of contemplation. "Truly remarkable." Crixus shot him a withering glare. "Remarkable? Have you gone mad, Phallus? These humans are nothing more than a nuisance, a thorn in the side of the Nebula Kingdom's rightful dominance." Phallus met the Admiral's gaze, his expression resolute. "That is where you are wrong, Crixus. These humans have shown us that they possess a strength of character and a willingness to fight for their principles that we cannot simply dismiss or ignore." He paused, his antennae twitching. "We have underestimated them at every turn, and in doing so, we may have sown the seeds of a conflict that could have dire consequences for the entire galaxy." Crixus opened his mouth to retort, but before he could, the bridge was rocked by a series of powerful explosions. The Nebula Kingdom fleet, despite its technological superiority, was struggling to withstand the onslaught of the human defense network. As the battle raged on, Phallus knew that the path forward would not be an easy one. The humans had proven themselves to be a formidable adversary, and the Nebula Kingdom would need to approach this situation with a newfound sense of caution and respect. But deep within him, Phallus also felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps in time, the two civilizations could find a way to bridge the divide and forge a lasting peace, one built on mutual understanding and a shared appreciation for the resilience and adaptability of all intelligent life. It would be a long and arduous journey, but Phallus was determined to see it through. The fate of the galaxy hung in the balance, and he knew that the Nebula Kingdom could no longer afford to underestimate the true power of humanity.